Pulling the Trigger is sponsored by Easy Vape North Shore, the industry's leading direct retailer of the highest quality personal vaporizers, e-cigs, vapes, and Canadian-made e-juice. Located at 987 Marine Drive in North Vancouver, or you can check them out online at www.easyvapecanada.com. You can also donate to the Pulling the Trigger Patreon account. Patreon is a membership platform that makes it easy for artists and creators to connect with their fans and get paid. That's at www.patreon.com/Mark Hughes Comic. And don't forget to like our Facebook page, facebook.com/PTG604. Welcome to Pulling the Trigger. I am Mark Hughes, and this is my podcast. It is wonderfully edited, produced, and posted, and all that technical stuff by Taylor Morey. Couldn't do it without him. And the date today is December 26, 2017, Boxing Day. Christmas is over. Good. I'm not a bah humbug guy. I don't really care one way or the other. I like the lights and stuff. They're pretty cool. But the family part, man, not really too much into that part. I come from a very weird and screwed up family, so I don't have the same feeling toward my family that most other people do. They're like work colleagues, so sometimes it's not always enjoyable hanging out with them if I don't have to. But I got some shit, and it was fun times all around. Still a bit injured from my fall the other day. If you didn't listen to last week's episode, I slipped and fell on the slush here and injured my ribs, and they're still quite sore. Sleeping is a bit of an issue, but whatever. I am not much has gone on since last week. I don't really know what to talk about in the intro. What's going on in my life? I'm just comedy, but it's kind of slow because over the last week, so I'll be doing some open mics and working on something in Edmonton. Maybe bringing the Comedy Shocker there. We'll see if some certain things work out. I want to take the Comedy Shocker on the road. It's been going on this will be its 4th year coming up, and I think some people outside of Vancouver need to see the show, and I think there's a thirst for it. This is an ongoing discussion I have with people, is whether or not so-called dirty comedy is marketable in the world, and I think it is. I think there's a lot of people who like so-called dirty comedy. For those of you who aren't really comedy fans, dirty comedy is an umbrella and general term for anything that has to do with sex or inappropriate or controversial or offensive subject matter. In the biz, it's called blue. Some people call it offensive. I don't even really think about things like that. And like, all my favorite comics are, depending on the joke, offensive. Not always, but it's. I just think about comedy and joking about whatever subject happens to be funny. But the industry does break it down, and if it can't be consumed by the general public, it gets deemed as dirty, and it can be harder to work as a so-called dirty comic. But shows are marketed as dirty so as to give them a theme to make them more appealing, and also to deter people from getting offended, who will then make a big deal about it, especially in the age of the internet. And I have discussions with comedians all the time about whether or not dirty comedy is viable, and a lot of the comedians just don't do it. They think they want to make a career out of it. They want to be as accessible as possible. They want to be able to get corporate gigs. Corporate gigs are for companies. And you have to be squeaky clean usually at them. There are exceptions to that, but no swearing. Nothing that can offend anyone. Nothing that Janice in accounting can go to HR with after the party. And there's a lot of money in it. So joking about stuff the way I do, there does tend to be problems. Like, I've been kicked out off of shows. I've been barred from shows and things like that. And people get offended. Sometimes people go on the internet and complain about me. So there are consequences to it. I'm considered a risk by many, even though a lot of people I know really like so-called dirty comedy. I didn't know until I started doing comedy that most comedians tend to steer clear of dirty stuff because people can get uncomfortable with it. I just joke around the way me and my friends joke around. And I started the Comedy Shocker actually because I was told by comedians when I first started doing it that dirty comedy won't work in Vancouver. People don't like it. And I said, I know lots of people who like it. I find a lot of the people who go to the Comedy Shocker are people who are really into, again, so-called dirty comedy. They don't really go to regular comedy shows. It's harder to get them to come out. So my mission has been to go and wrangle up the people who like dirty comedy. Or even if they don't like it, don't think about it that way. They just want to laugh at jokes and they don't care what the subject matter is. And they won't laugh if the joke's not funny, but they're not listening to the joke through a filter of if the subject matter is appropriate or not, right? And then there's the people who want the subject matter to be as inappropriate as possible, and they're my favorite. And I try and explain to people that, like, I joke about what comes into my head, and anytime I try and sit there and write clean purposely and just be like, okay, no matter what, I'm going to force myself to write clean, it just comes out really stale and it's really difficult. And who knows, maybe with time I'll get more natural at just writing about things that are less controversial, things that come to my head. But my brain's still all fucking traumatized and stuff like that on some days. And, you know, I don't want to use it as a cop-out or to go into this, but I know that I can't speak to myself so much because I've only lived in my brain. But when I see other people who've come from backgrounds like mine, they don't exactly view life through normal lenses, right? So what would they joke about? What if they were to start making little quips about things? What would it look like? I don't know. What does someone who spent most of their life in prison and on the streets and drug addicted and comes from kind of a fucked up family and all these kinds of things and been abused and what do they sound like? How do they present? I don't know. It's a good question. There's probably differences, but I don't think they're gonna talk about like The Office so much, or because most of us can't even get an office job, right? Or taking the bus. Or the way I joke about the bus is going to be different than another person jokes about the bus, and I that's fine. The guy who jokes about things that are quote unquote family friendly, that's fine. Go ahead. Like if it's funny, fucking A. It doesn't tend to be the type of comedy I like very much. I tend to like someone getting hurt in my jokes, but that's just personal preference. But I also like some really clean comedians, like Jim Gaffigan. He's very clean. And I can't explain why I like him. I just find him funny. Just what the stuff he says I think is really funny. I like Jerry Seinfeld, who's very funny too, and very clean. So these are ongoing struggles I have all the time. I'm probably going to be moving out of Vancouver within the next 18 months or something like that, even if it's just for 2 to 3 months, because I feel there's there's more opportunities for me to get better and to maybe get more paid work outside of this city. We'll see. I mean, I might be wrong about that too. I'm still not at a level where I think I can make a living at comedy, but I would like it to not be as expensive as it is right now. Comedy still costs me a lot of money, and it takes up a huge portion of my life. I'm out 5 nights a week doing comedy, sitting around waiting to go up, and I'm always thinking about it, and I'm always talking about it, and that's on top of my regular job, and that's on top of doing laundry, that's on top of social life, not which there isn't much of anymore. And so I would like it to, whatever the next level is, I'd like to take it there, and for now I'm directing that towards another city, and see what happens there. So that's what's going on in my life, if you care. Or that's a bunch of whining and rambling that you don't care about, but whatever. The guest we have this week is a man I met while I was still in prison, Don Wright. He is the founder and current educational coordinator. He used to be the director, but he's phasing out, as he'll talk about in the episode. He's the founder and educational coordinator of the BC Society for Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse. It's one of only 4 in Canada organizations that deal with male survivors of sexual abuse. Not solely either, which he'll explain, but it's one of the only ones set up with the target demographic being for male survivors of sexual abuse. Anyone who's listened to me doing this podcast or perform knows that I am someone who survived sexual abuse. And I met, when I was in prison doesn't offer, the penitentiary that I was in, well, the system doesn't offer counseling for sexual abuse. They say it's beyond their scope. and they don't have the staffing for it, and they don't get the funding for it. So when I went looking to get treatment or therapy for this sexual abuse, I found male survivors, and they were actually able to help me find funding. So that's one of the cool things about them is Don says they never turn away a client. They will find a way to make it work. And I have nothing but respect for what they do. I'll speak to the experience of being a male survivor. It can be a tough thing to talk about. There's a variety of reasons why it's hard to talk about, which Don and I both talk about in the episode. And it's nice to know that there are people who are willing to help people who want to get help with this stuff. And he's got a tough job too. He explains it. It's not easy when the target demographic is men these days. It's often dismissed. It's harder to find funding, etc. But I do believe that if a good portion of male survivors were able to get help, and it was more socially acceptable for men to get help, a lot of sexual violence would go down. I don't think it's necessarily the sole cause. I think there will always be that pathological ski mask rapist type who is fucked up or a psychopath or something like that and just will commit random acts of sexual violence. But there are a number of offenders who offend because they were offended against. And I think if a lot of us could get, and offending doesn't always mean sexually. For example, I committed crimes, property crimes, and later on some violent crimes to violent property crimes. And not that if it had been presented to me, I would have got it, but let's just say, if I had gotten treatment for the sexual abuse, my life might have been different. But I was pretty dedicated to the criminal life, so what can I say? That's what it was too. But I know I don't speak for everyone. And I know there are men who probably do need to know about this organization. I'm surprised when I talk to people, even people who are involved in like mental health and addictions or social justice or all that, don't even know this organization exists. Because where would you send a man? If, let's say, he can't afford private therapy, private counseling, where would you send a man? Rape relief? They don't deal with male victims. They deal with female victims. So the crisis center can help, but mainly there's not much available to men. In fact, these days it's politically incorrect to bring up male survivors because a lot of feminist organizations and groups think that it's stealing the spotlight or males are trying to hijack the sexual abuse conversation. But I'll let some of these points be made more clearly when we talk to Don here. So, Don Wright, you were saying you're training someone to take over.
Well, I've been doing this for 28 years, and I I had the option of retiring several years ago, but committed to the work, and I never really found someone that wanted the position, and I thought really would hold it in the right kind of carriage. I want someone who's going to continue the same vision. And the person I have now does hold the same vision. And he officially took over in the summer. But what I did is I removed all the educational responsibilities, like supervising our master's and doctoral students, doing training seminars, doing media interviews, speaking at conferences, anything that's educational. We have a training seminar that we do a couple times a year here, and then I travel around the country and into the U.S. doing whatever I get invited to do. And that lightens his burden considerably, which would have been a rather onerous job to take on fresh. For me, it evolved from being an answering machine to a very complex agency that it is today. So I kind of grew into the job, but when it's kind of thrust upon you, full on, it's a lot to take on. So by splitting the job, it makes it less daunting for him. And what I've done is I've created a position as education coordinator.
For yourself?
Yeah, for myself. And so I step into that. And so I'm still around when I can back him up. Yesterday I attended a criminal justice review meeting where we're really looking at revising criminal justice in Canada. He was not able to attend, so I went in his place. That was great. I'm around. But it also allows me to put more energy into the educational program, which I think is really important. I mean, out of the 12 therapists that work for me, all but 2 started out as practicum students, including the registered psychologist that's on staff.
Oh, wow.
He started out as a master's student with me 17, 18 years ago, and he's still here.
Still here? Oh,
yeah.
wow. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a number of staff that have been here around that long.
Oh, wow.
People don't leave. In fact, part of the reason we have branch offices is somebody will move out of town and open up a branch office somewhere. So.
And for the listeners, I'm talking to Don Wright, who is I'll let you describe.
Founder and a former executive director of the BC Society for Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse. And as I was just describing, I've passed that role on to somebody else. I'm still around for probably another year as education coordinator. But it's all started in 1989. I started an agency in Victoria, and then in 1990 started a separate agency in Vancouver and started commuting between the 2 cities. Did that for 13 years.
Oh, wow.
In 97, we amalgamated the 2 and changed the name to the BC Society for Male Survivors to reflect more of a provincial profile.
Right.
And in the early 2000s, I've forgotten exactly the date, we had to close the Victoria office. It was just losing money so fast that it was bringing down the whole agency, so we closed it. But since then, we've continued to grow. We've got 5 locations now, 12 therapists, 2 victim services worker, administrative assistant. We span 3 health regions. We've got an office in Courtenay, and then the rest are here on the Lower Mainland.
And your client base, patient base, whatever the consumer base is primarily male survivors of sexual abuse?
I'm guessing it's about 5 years ago, our mandate was expanded to include men who are victims of domestic violence. So we do get some of those. It's a much smaller number. I'd say maybe 10% of our clients are victims of spousal assault. It's not in our name, and the word is not really out there. I think there's certainly a lot more men who are victims of spousal assault than we're seeing. The same is true of sexual abuse, but, until it's relevant to you, you don't really notice it. And you have to that's why advertising is repetitive, because they have to hit you with it several times before it sinks in. So, we had a bus ad campaign, and I think a lot of people saw our ad, but probably it didn't quite register until they saw it 2 or 3 times, and it's sort of like, oh, right, yeah, that's relevant to me, and they call me up. So we have a victim services program, which assists people dealing with the legal processes, like making a police report, finding a lawyer if they want to initiate a civil suit or a small claims court. If it's going to trial locally, they can sit through the trial and provide support. They also help clients apply for compensation programs. And every program that we're aware of across the country that our clients can qualify for, we've got the application forms here. And our victim services workers are familiar with the criteria, the process, so that if a client, say, is a victim in Ontario, we've got the application form here. We know what they expect, and we can make sure that the client is well prepared for that.
That's definitely changed. I remember I first came in contact with you guys, and it would have been 2002 or 2003. And I remember at the time, you guys, I think, were still learning how the compensation and funding worked with each of the provinces and things like that.
Yeah.
You guys found me the RAP program,
right?
RHAP, Residential Historical Abuse Program. Got to explain things to people.
Well, yeah, and a lot of people, because of the name, think it has to do with residential schools. It doesn't.
Yeah.
It's foster care, juvenile detention center, provincial hospital. As long as you're under the age of 18 and considered to be a ward of the provincial government in some capacity, then you qualify.
And that was me. My abuse happened in a young offender institution. So,
yeah. So the good thing about that program, it doesn't require a police report.
Right.
You just, I was in care. They checked the files. Yes, in fact, you were great. You're approved. And each health region manages it differently. And Vancouver Coastal Health, where this office is the best of the 3 regions that we're in. They pay a higher rate. They cover clients longer. I've got a client that's been covered now for probably 8 years, and they're still covering him. Whereas Fraser Health Authority will only offer 24 sessions and a possible extension for another 8. But you barely get past trust building, let alone getting into some serious work.
I remember that came up when I was living in Abbotsford. We got one extension. An 8-session extension, I think, is what it was.
Yeah, that's kind of typical. And they pay a lower rate. But I mean, so does well, Vancouver's fine. I'm not going to complain about what they pay us. It's pretty good. And Vancouver Island, they also pay a lower rate, but I think they might cover longer. But we haven't had an active rap client over there for a while, so I don't know what it would. Actually, I have one now, and we're in the process of renewing his claim because he's in Nanaimo, and we're doing phone therapy. But I've known him since 1992. That's when he started out with me when he lived here in Vancouver. So we've got this long relationship that justifies us continuing to work, even though it's over the phone.
Wow. So what got you into this? What made you start doing this?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I get asked that a lot. A lot of people wonder if perhaps I'm a survivor, and that was the motivation. Wasn't the case. I was lucky enough not to have been a victim of sexual abuse, but I was bullied in high school, so I know it's not the same, but every day when I approached the school, I would approach it with trepidation. Is it going to happen today? Am I going to avoid it? What am I going to have to deal with? And the same thing for a survivor of sexual abuse. Anytime you approach the environment in which the offender is, you have that same anxiety and wondering if you're going to be able to escape it somehow, or if it's going to happen, how bad is it going to be, etc. But really, the way I got into this, all three of my degrees were geared towards working with gifted children. I got 2 bachelor's and a master's degree. And I was working with a female survivor, and I consulted with a professor that I had done a TA for when I was doing my degree. And she seemed to think I was always doing the right thing with this female survivor. I seemed to be always on track. So she and the executive director of the Women's Sexual Assault Center in Victoria asked me if I was interested in setting up a male survivor program under their umbrella. So I had a teaching job at Fraser University, which had just come to an end because it was replacing somebody that was on maternity leave. So I didn't really have anything solid on the horizon. So I figured, this sounds like a good thing to do. I'll get it going. I'll set it up. I'll get it running, and then I'll pass it on to somebody, and I'll go on to working with gifted children. I never left. I'm still here. But when somebody asked
reluctantly trying to leave too.
Yeah. Somebody asked me the same question, and when I got to this point, I said, come to think of it, I'm working with gifted children now who are adults, and they have spent their entire life burdened by trauma. So really a big part of my job is alleviating the burden so that they can discover their own potential that's been dormant all these years. So everyone's got more gifts than they realize. It's an opportunity. I could be really good at something, but I've never had an opportunity to learn and find out whether my skill abilities match that particular thing. I know I'm a good dancer, but I'm not a good musician. I've got all these instruments at home. I can't play any of them. In fact, my joke is I have trouble playing a radio.
Yeah, I remember when I tried to learn guitar, I realized pretty quick that this is going to require a lot of time and discipline, and it's one of those things. I think we all have certain things that are just extra hard for us. Like you might be good at this, and I'm just naturally not good at it. And guitar was one of those things. I'm like, this is going to take me probably twice as long to learn how to play. Yeah. I could do it. I realized if I put enough time and effort in, I would. And I had to sort of do a unconscious decisional balance. I'm like, nah, I'll never be a rock star. That's okay. Right?
Yeah. Well, I took guitar lessons for 3 years, way back in, grade school, junior high, somewhere along that time. And I really couldn't play anything by the end of it all. I mean, I could kind of fumble my way through, but just like you, it was not going to be a natural thing for me. It was, my dad was musically inclined. He'd pick up any instrument and pick out a tune. And he never had lessons.
Wow.
Whereas I am a good dancer. I've danced in a couple musicals. I feel the music in my body and I respond to it. So I know that that's a more natural thing for me, but I never had an opportunity to really study it. I mean, like you say, I danced in a couple musicals way back when, but it was hardly, a professional gig.
Retirement's coming.
Yes,
you'll have plenty of free time. Right?
Yeah.
So one of the reasons that I wanted to interview you is because I have a great deal of admiration and respect for this organization, right? Because just to give it some background for the listener's sake and to jog your memory, I was in prison when I first came in contact with you guys.
Right.
And I had never really acknowledged, I knew I had been, I guess, sexually abused. If you know what, if you catch my drift.
Right.
Yeah, I guess it had happened. And it wasn't like I was even I knew I'd been raped.
Right.
Forcibly sodomized, right? So, guy threatened
that qualifies.
Oh, yeah. But I'd always minimized it.
Yeah.
I always thought, well, fuck, whatever. That's just what happens. Just move on, right? And then I started realizing I was having problems because of it. Sorry, let me correct that. It's not that I was having problems and I thought that might be connected to it. I didn't necessarily. So I was in prison at the time. Prison their mandate is not to deal with stuff like that, right? Also, clinically, there's going to be a whole bunch of barriers to that anyway. So someone suggested your organization, and I found you guys, and Judy was the therapist at the time, and you guys helped me find funding, and I've kind of been in contact on and off with you since then.
And then you were in a group that Judy and I did together.
Right. Yep, that's right. And then I came and saw you privately, individually, when I got out of prison a few years ago, right? Yeah. And I've been, it's one of the themes with some of my guests, 2 or 3 of them now, is I've come in contact with them in various different contexts. Right. Like the last episode that was released, Roger, he's a prison guard. I've met him in prison. He used to lock me up. I've met him in substance abuse support groups. He's also a recovering alcoholic and addict, and he does stand-up comedy now sometimes. Oh well, right. So it's this kind of string theory or whatever it is. It's like a wheel of life, and you always come back to it. But the other reason is that I wanted to talk to you is because as someone who's gone through therapy and had to deal with being a male survivor of sexual abuse, especially in the digital age, especially in the age of what I would call social justice, I found that it can actually be difficult identifying as a male survivor of sexual abuse, because feminism and identity politics, the popular narrative tends to be that any mention of being a male survivor detracts from women's experiences or the work that's being done with women. And it's like some of the common things I hear is sit down, time to listen to women, or that's so statistically insignificant, there's no point in even bringing it up. You're just trying to derail the code. These are all things I've actually heard. And not just me, I've seen with... So, long way to get to one question that hopefully will get into a bunch of other questions. When you started this, did you have any pushback or
it wasn't so much pushback because it was a women's sexual assault center that approached me.
Yeah, their endorsement basically.
But what I did get is a lot of people thinking, oh well, if you did a formal survey, you're not going to find anything. And so I did an informal survey, and sure enough, I didn't really find much. In fact, I went to the counseling services at UVic, and they said in 15 years they had one student disclose sexual abuse.
One male
in 15
student.
years, one male student. Now, on their intake form, because I used to work at counseling services and their learning skills program, you can check off different issues, homesickness, stress, anxiety, sleeplessness, whatever. But they don't have sexual abuse on their intake form. So who's going to check that off if there's no box for it? Right. So for a guy to admit that he's been a victim of sexual abuse, like when the popular narrative is that it's all about women being abused by, a bunch of nasty men, he's going to feel like he's some kind of freak of nature because he's a victim. Well, in fact, at the child abuse level, the numbers are equal, 50-50 boy-girl victims. And certainly in a bigger city, you're going to find that equal distribution. In a small community like, say, Vanderhoof, BC, population 150 or whatever it is, it's not much bigger than a junction. There may be, let's set aside incest, which could happen. But if there's a pedophile in that community, either male or female, that prefers boys or girls, then the gender preference is going to be at high risk in that community. And so all the children will be of the same gender because that's the preference of their resident pedophile. Right. But in a bigger city, or a city of any substantial size, even something as big as Kelowna, is going to have a number of pedophiles on the prowl. And then the numbers equal off across the board. At the adult rape level, I think it's a lot closer than people will admit. And of course, women don't want male victimization to be talked about, because I was at a meeting many years ago and one woman actually said, I don't think we should acknowledge male victimization because it's going to set back the women's movement by 20 years. Well, if the movement is set back 20 years by the truth, it's flawed in the first place. Why don't they just talk about violence in our communities? All of it. One of my favorite catchphrases is, you can't cure a contagious disease by treating half the population that are infected with it. Now, a small number of survivors actually become offenders, both male and female, which is another myth. We used to think, well, I didn't ever thought this, but the popular notion is that all male survivors become perpetrators.
They called it the Dracula syndrome. I heard it referred to one time.
Yeah, but it's not true. The reason that people thought that is, first of all we knew about were female victims, but feminism never acknowledges female perpetration. I get tongue-tied. It's just not in their lexicon. Female perpetrators of violence, either sexual or physical, is not in their mindset. And they will not allow themselves to acknowledge that, which I think is a big flaw. If they said, we know women are also capable of violence and we have programs set up to treat these women, guys, now we want you to step up. I mean, lead by example, but they don't. Their example is women good, men bad, across the board. And so that's the popular belief system. And the other thing is that the only male survivors that we knew about were the small number that became offenders and were in the prison system. And probably less than 10% of survivors become perpetrators. But that small percentage can have 100 victims each. And so exponentially it expands again. And then of that number, you got another 10%. So before this agency existed, there was no place for a non-offending male victim to become visible. And even now, there's maybe 4 programs across the entire country for male survivors.
That's what one of the questions I was going to ask is how when I talk about your organization, BC Society for Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse, I would say half the people I mention it to who are people who are kind of in the know. They know about all kinds of different stuff. They're educated. They're in touch with clinical people. They're in touch with social justice, feminists that don't even know it exists.
Oh, I know. Yeah. And like I say, I've been doing this for 28 years. I've been on TV, radio, newspaper, magazine. We've got bus ads in the, inside interior cards in the buses. And yet still people think, oh, are you new? Well, no. But, yeah, I think that, well, it's so often they run into this thing about, men are not supposed to speak up. This hashtag Me Too thing, for example, was an example of people coming out against Harvey Weinstein. And of course, there were women, but then a lot of men have started coming forward. In fact, I was invited to lead a town hall meeting with male members of ACTRA. Mm-hmm. And the first time I met with them, there were 23 guys in the room. The second time we met, there were 19. In 2 weeks, we're meeting again. And it really turns out to be a therapy session, which I acknowledged the last time. I said, most of you in the room have shared stories of being sexually assaulted, harassed, or at least propositioned by a producer, casting director, film, director, or instructor. There were several young guys in the room, and 3 of them had all been propositioned by an instructor at one of the acting schools. And so they dropped out of the school and were afraid to approach any other instructors. And getting an acting coach is important for your profession. Just like as a therapist, we have case consultation teams that we get together and we all talk cases. So they were saying like 4 or 5, maybe 6 years before they had the courage to approach another coach. And they did a lot of checking around. And even when they did approach this person, they approached with a lot of trepidation. Is it going to happen again, or is this guy going to be okay? Well, it turns out that one of the coaches that they are getting coaching from was in the room. And he wasn't himself a victim of sexual abuse or harassment, but his partner, who's an actress, had been propositioned. So, like I say, everybody in the room were either directly harassed or assaulted or propositioned, or a couple of them who didn't fit that category had partners that were harassed. One of them shared a story about, confidentiality, I can't mention names, but there was a major Hollywood actress who was filming up here, and she was drunk, doing coke, and coming on to the guys and being really bitchy. And complaining about her didn't really get him anywhere. And so often, if you're just small potatoes in the business, you don't get hired. One man was abused by a director who had done a lot of movies for a now departed big name Hollywood actress. And he was her go-to director. And he propositioned this guy in the room, and he refused. This was 30 years ago or something. And it took years for him to get any more work.
Just because he turned the guy down.
Yeah. He almost had to leave the country and get work elsewhere and then come back. And sometimes that's what happens. If you don't cooperate, you don't get hired. So you've got to go up completely outside of this environment. Go to Great Britain or where it's Canada, US, you cross that border and you might get some work. And if you start getting a reputation for yourself, I mean, as being a quality actor, then you might be able to come back to your home country. And because your name has gotten some cred, you can now get work again. In the meantime, whatever happened in the past is kind of, it's all water under the bridge. But it's so pandemic. And one of the major concerns that we shared is what about all the young guys now coming into the profession that all starry-eyed and, I want to be an actor. I want to be the next Tom Cruise or whatever, whoever his idol is. And then he gets hit on. And if the message is, if you want to get anywhere in this business, you're going to have to put out. He's going to have to put out. And a few might not really mind. They might say, well, so what? So I sucked some guy's cock. Big deal. I got the role. No big deal. And he's not even gay, but he's okay with, because he doesn't see that.
Sees it as a transaction.
Yeah, it's not a big cost for what the outcome. But, sometimes people get used and tossed aside. They give you this great promise, but when they're bored with you and attracted to the other new guy coming along, they'll drop you without you getting this great breakthrough that you thought you were going to get. So it's a bad situation. But so many professions. We know about coaches, we know about priests, we know about supervisors and bosses, we know about prison guards. It's in every environment there are predators. And there's more predators where someone is vulnerable. And vulnerability is a broad term. Certainly, if you're a child, you're vulnerable. If you're drunk or stoned, you're vulnerable.
Senior
if you're
citizen
impoverished,
or disabled,
yeah. If you're a minority, if the only way you can get an apartment because you're the wrong color is to accommodate the landlord, it's everywhere. And this is where I think a lot of people need some education. You see some guy who's like 6'2" and looks like he's a football player, and it's hard for them to comprehend that this guy could possibly be victimized. He can be drugged. He can be gang raped and overpowered by a bunch of guys that are big as him, if not bigger. So it doesn't matter who you are. In the wrong situation, anyone can be a victim of sexual assault.
A new trend that I've just seen some talking about on the internet, guys talking about experiences they've had, is women offending by blackmailing the men to have sex with the ultimate mind fuck. I'll claim you raped me if you don't fuck me.
Yeah.
Shit. Now, anyone listening to this might be going, oh, that's probably so statistically insignificant. But I've seen it enough times on the internet, guys saying that women will ruin their reputation somehow, some way, if they don't sleep with them. That, because there's nothing new under the sun. If 2 or 3 guys say this happened to them, and there's 5 billion people, or what are we at? 6 billion people on the planet.
Yeah.
0.1% of people doing that is still going to be in the thousands.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So...
Yeah. Well, as I said recently at a meeting, if there's only one man in the whole city of Vancouver that's the victim of sexual abuse, he has the right to be acknowledged and to be supported, to get justice, to get therapy, whatever he needs to recover from that experience. But I know that 25% of the male population has been victimized in some capacity. I don't really count this much. I mean, it's a pretty minimal experience, but I was working in display at Woodward's when I was going to university, and I was in the suit department. And the guy that works in suits walked by and kind of slides his hand across my bum. Well, I mean, that's sexual assault. I'm not going to get therapy over it. I'm not going to run to the police and make a report. But that was a violation of my personal boundaries, and it was of a sexual nature. So when I say I'm not a victim, I kind of forget about that. But I said to him, I don't like that. Please don't do that again. He said, why didn't mean anything by it? And I said, it doesn't matter what you meant by it. I don't like it. I don't want it. And he never touched me again. If he had, I'd gone to his supervisor and I would have gotten him fired. That's not appropriate.
No.
It's a pretty innocuous thing, through the clothes, sliding his hand across my bum, compared to what some of my clients experience. It's pretty minor, but that's just an example of how pretty much everybody's probably got some experience. We also use the term sexuality abuse. And that term involves what we understand to be sexual abuse, but a lot of more covert experiences. Like, let's say you're at the change room at the pool. You're in the shower and some guy's leering at you. He's not saying anything to you. He's not touching you. But you can tell by the way he looks at you and the way he's spending more time washing his genitals that he's interested. Now, it's uncomfortable and it's creepy. Unless you're there for that, it's going to feel uncomfortable. And that's an intrusion of your privacy. You should be able to go in there, have your shower, not have someone leering at you. So most people have had some kind of an experience where they feel like their personal space is violated.
When I got out of prison, I was actually, this is how warped my life was. I was surprised to meet people who'd never been molested when they were kids. When I started hanging around quote unquote normal people,
right,
meeting people who'd never had any kind of extreme abuse happen to them. Yeah. Most men I know, not these days just because the demographics I associate with are a lot different, but when I first got out of prison, I was hanging around recovery circles. Almost every guy there has been molested in fact, I would say in the recovery circle, in some of the recovery circles I've been in, there are more male victims than female victims. Yeah. I have been personally sexually assaulted more times than some women I know. Right? Yeah. And so when I got out of prison and I saw that the society has changed and it's more open to talking about things like abuse and all that kind of stuff, I was very shocked to be shut down for bringing it up as a male survivor. Yeah. And so you're saying that male victimization is actually pretty common.
Yeah, I just read a statistic the other day about domestic violence, and I've forgotten who did the study. I should have these things in the top of my brain so I can quote them. But there was a study done, and they were looking at male and female victims of spousal assault. There were 1,200 and something female victims and 1,200 and something male victims. The difference was about 30.
Wow.
They were that close. But men don't talk about it because men feel, both in sexual abuse, but certainly in spousal assault, that their masculinity has been diminished by being victimized. So if I'm a survivor of domestic violence and I admit that my wife is beating me up, I'm basically saying I'm kind of a wimp, aren't I? A woman is beating me up. Well, a lot of guys, and this certainly was my upbringing, that you don't hit women. And I've never hit a woman. Fortunately, I've never been hit by one either. Mm. But if some woman was freaking out on me, I would first try to protect myself. I'd try to get away. But if I had to hit her back or get her down on the ground and to protect myself, I would. It doesn't matter. Gender doesn't matter. I'm being attacked. I'm going to defend myself. And a lot of times, people in a spousal assault situation do fight back. If it's the male, then he's not considered to be fighting back. He's considered an initiator. If a woman is violent in a relationship, she's considered to be defending herself from a violent male. And I have somebody in town, I'm not going to mention names, she's the head of another organization, and we used to be quite at odds at one point, but we've really kind of come around. And we have an uncomfortable alliance in a way.
I have lots of people like that.
Yeah, she's very much feminist, and her perspective is male patriarchy, male dominant society, blah, blah, blah. And I know that I can only challenge her so far because she's so rigid in her belief system. And she acknowledged yesterday when we were at a meeting, at this criminal justice meeting, that, yeah, men can be abused, but we have to look at the context. We have to look at the patriarchy. Well, I think, first of all, patriarchy is a misnomer because patriarchy comes from the Latin word for father. Of course, father, male, and so male energy bad, And matriarchy, which comes from the Latin word for mother, female energy, good. But the truth is that in a patriarchal society, which is what we have, again, I don't like that term, a more accurate term would be a hierarchical social structure. Because anyone in power, whether they're male, female, black, white, young, old, Catholic, Jewish, whatever, can and do exploit their positions of power. Not 100%, but the system is set up. Now, I think this agency is quite egalitarian. I don't think that I'm more important because I'm the founder and was the executive director. I also vacuum. I also take out the garbage. I also change the toilet paper roll. Nobody's more important than anybody else here. But there are times when the final decision came down to me and I said, no, we're not going to do it that way. Because somebody has to. We can't debate forever. I take in other people's opinions and I respect it. And sometimes we'll say, okay, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Yeah, we'll do that. But there are times when, whether it's because of legal reasons or because of our society bylaws or just because the system is working and to change it is not going to be an improvement, I'll just say, no, it's not going to happen that way. But rarely have I ever done that. But when you think about Christy Clark, she was in power and she was abusing her power. She was there to help her friends and herself and to hell with everybody else. Any woman in power is going to behave like a man in power. Now, it may be that the majority of power positions are held by men, but power positions are relatively few compared to the rest of us.
No matter what, it's a minority group.
Yeah.
It's a powerful minority group, but it's still a minority group.
Yeah, but you take some wealthy West Van woman who has domestic servants and she treats them like dirt, especially if they're immigrant population. Like, you can't use my bathroom, do it before you come to work. I've actually heard that stated. Golda Meir, Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi. These are all world leaders that were just as domineering in their positions as men are. So a hierarchical social structure is a more accurate reflection of the reality. It is a hierarchical structure, and people in power abuse their power. But it's not along gender lines. It may be that the majority of positions are held by men, but that's changing. There are way more women in education now than there used to be, graduating from university.
Isn't it like 2 to 1, like is in universities now?
It's something like that.
Anything outside of science, it's like 2 to 1 women to men or something. Yeah. Just from what I understand.
But even in the sciences, there's more and more women. So women are moving into power positions. And when you look at some of the women that are in power now, they're not behaving all benevolently and all full of goodness and light. They're acting like men. So instead of patriarchy, let's call hierarchical social structure. Instead of matriarchy, because in a matriarchal system, both men and women are egalitarian in their attitudes. And they cooperate and they work together. So instead of using matriarchy, which again divides things by way of gender, let's call it an egalitarian social structure. Because in essence, that's what it is. Because in an egalitarian system, everyone is equal. And everyone respects that equality. In fact, they've done experiments with primates, and I've forgotten whether it was gorillas or what particular primate it was, but they would remove the aggressive males from the troop. And what was left was non-aggressive males and females. And from then on, the aggression would pretty much disappear within that troop. And when there are aggressive males in the troop, the females would also be aggressive in some way, in some situations. But by removing aggressive energy from the context, things change. So if we really looked at our social systems and not looking at gender lines, but the structure itself, and set up more of there was an attempt to do that with unions. Unions came along to try to balance out the administration or the governing body of any kind of business. But the unions became their own power struggle in themselves. And so now unions and bosses fight for dominance. But again, the attitude is that somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. But if we had a social structure in which everything was approached with an attitude of cooperation, what is the best solution to our particular dilemma or to improve the product or to sell the product? What's the best way to approach it? Let's all pool our ideas and work cooperatively. And I think that we do that by and large here. And I hope that people are learning through our modeling examples of egalitarian relationships. People are paid at different rates, but that usually has to do with the nature of their job, the source of the funding that pays for that job, and how long they've been here. So the highest paid hourly rate on staff is a female therapist that's been here for 18 years. Because she would get periodical raises, and the other people are getting raises. Well, right now raises have been frozen until we get some more money coming in. But the rate that people are getting paid at is not based on their gender. It's how long they've been here, and like you say, the source of the money that covers them. Like our victim services worker, that money comes from the ministry, and based on the money they give us, that's what we pay them. If they give us an increase, they get an increase. But we're limited to what we get from that particular source. Right. And the same with the therapist. It's either client-generated fees, either through out-of-pocket or through compensation, and a little bit of subsidy that we get from the health region for this location. Mm. So again, limited resources determine whether or not people get raises or how much they get paid to start and how long they have to wait to get, all that kind of stuff.
Because this is an organization that tends to focus on males. This is one I hear often, that one of the reasons that sometimes feminist-based organizations or women-centered, female-centric organizations get their backs up regarding male, the talk of male abuse and things like that, is that they're worried their funding will get affected. Do you get less money because it's for men?
Yeah. I've forgotten exactly when it was. Several years ago, the provincial government came up with a population formula for victim services workers. So based on the population of a particular community, there could be X number of positions specializing for different groups. And what's relevant to us, of course, was victim services workers working with male survivors. We had an office in Victoria at that time, and because of the population of Victoria, there could be one designated victim services worker specializing in male victims for the city of Victoria.
Which is about, give or take, 300,000, 400,000 people.
Yeah. And half of those are men, 25% are victims. The math is not good. In Vancouver, we were authorized to have 2 specialized victim services workers, and that's still the case.
For a city of approximately, what are we at now? Almost 2 million, if you count the GVRD.
Yeah. And outside of Vancouver, out in the outlying communities, there are no designated victim services workers. Other organizations, particularly which are typically organizations that work with women, are now required to provide victim services for men. And a lot of them resent that. In fact, I heard 2 talking at a conference, and one of them said, "Are you required to see men now?" And said, "Yes." "What about you?" "Yes, we are too." "How do you feel about it?" "I don't like it. I have a right to feel safe." And then later on, actually they sat in on my workshop, they were saying that they were afraid men would pretend to be victims in order to come in and find out what happened to their estranged partner. So what happens is that every male victim that approaches this organization is met with suspicion and distrust. How is that healing for him? And at what point are they going to say, okay, we now believe that you're actually a victim? Does he have to bend over and show the rectal tearing from being raped?
Yeah,
is that what it takes?
How detailed does the account have to be?
Yeah, I mean, when are they going to actually trust him?
It's so interesting that you bring an example like that up, because sometimes when I'm trying to have civil dialogue with female-centric or feminist type people who are involved in social justice and stuff like that, and I bring up these scenarios similar to what you just described, them saying, what if they make it up? What if they falsify the account just so they can do some kind of espionage?
Yeah.
They said, come on, Mark. That's ridiculous. No one would ever do that. And I think, in an odd way, and I know how weird this might, or histrionic this might make me sound, I start feeling like, am I being gaslit here? Like, don't you ladies or people, whatever, say that your experiences are dismissed?
Yeah.
And the thing I find interesting is, and maybe it's because I was on the streets. Maybe it's because I spent time in prison. I got to see how depraved humanity can be. And I'm not just talking about the inmates. For our listeners, I'm not just talking about the inmates. When someone goes, this happened to me, really weird, absurd scenario where some kind of malevolence was inflicted on another person, I'm never like, no, that couldn't have happened. Right. I'm always like, yeah, I can see that. Yeah. I'm fully aware of how fucked up humanity can be. Yeah. And I don't know, maybe people are privileged or sheltered or soft or something. Like, I don't understand how people can't see how just because they're a woman they couldn't rape someone or they couldn't fuck someone over, they couldn't assume the worst out of people.
Well, I think most people see reality through their own eyes, and it's very difficult to step outside your own experience and imagine the world being different than what you've experienced.
Egocentrism.
Yeah. But to come back to the funding, at that time when there was that population formula that was put into place, there was a women's program somewhere up in central BC. Their cutback was larger than the funding that we had for Vancouver and Victoria combined.
Wow.
Their cutback. Now, some of these women's organizations have been around longer than we have, and you get incremental increases, then you do fundraising and so on.
Seniority and experience.
Like Better Women's Support Services has a 10-year lead on us. We've been around 28 years. They've been around 38 years. So they have accumulated support and funding, and the program is continuing to grow. So I think there's a closer parity now. But there are programs that are specifically set up for programs for women. Like there's violence against women in relationship is a provincial government funding stream. Violence against women in relationship, not against people in relationship. And
so in order to qualify, you have to be a woman.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Or a program serving women.
Right.
That's what it's for.
Right.
And then there's Stopping the Violence, which is another funding stream that's predominantly for women. Now, technically, I should be able to apply to those programs because we're working with victims of sexual abuse or domestic violence. But in reality, preference is not going to be given to this program. If all the women's programs get all the funding they need and they're happy and they aren't even asking for any more money, then they will let us. I'm actually trying to raise some funding to buy a house, like a heritage house, to move our head office and our Vancouver Day program into, but also to have a crisis suite for men leaving a violent relationship or our survivor clients that are high risk for suicide, because the emergency ward is a bad option. I won't get into some of the stories around that, but I approached BC Housing, which is a provincial government body, and I said, this is what I want to do. And they said, well, our mandate is to provide funding for transition houses for women and children. And I said, are you not a government branch? And does not the government represent all citizens of BC? That actually is an example of sexism. And they said, oh, well, we probably wouldn't have any program funding, but we might be able to have capital funding. And I'll talk to some people and see. Well, they never got back to me. But then again, I tried to get back to them, and the person I was talking to was not available, and we just haven't been able to reconnect. But I've been working on a proposal, and why not provide capital funding? Because if I could buy a place, the $3,900, we pay nearly $4,000 a month rent for this place. So if I could buy something outright, if I had the funds,
got to pay the property taxes.
That $4,000 times 12 months would cover property tax, insurance, minor maintenance, and would also provide money to subsidize our programs to clients. Now, if we raise enough money to buy something where the mortgage payments are $2,500 a month, I calculate that's about an $18,000 savings in the first year. Well, when you get a fixed mortgage, it stays the same for like 5 years, but you get rent increases every year. So every year, that $18,000 saving gets a little bit bigger. So it would be a monetarily viable thing for us to buy a house to move the agency into. In the long run, it would cost a lot less money for us and therefore the government. We wouldn't have to ask them for so much operating funding if we weren't paying so much in rent. My math is bad. I don't know what 12 times 4,000 is, but it's a lot of money.
Someone listening will chime in and have a better...
that's about $48,000 a year.
Right.
That's a lot of money.
More than I make at my job.
Yeah, it's almost what I make in this job.
These female organizations or female centric or services that serve women.
Yeah.
I don't know how to put this, but I'll just say it. Do you get along with most of them? Are you allied with them?
Because I've never really approached it from an adversarial, competitive perspective. My agenda is to look at the whole picture. We need to acknowledge all victims, all perpetrators, regardless of gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic strata, because if we ever want to end violence in our communities, we have to acknowledge all people that are involved in it, even secondary victims. You know, if you're a parent and your kid gets sexually abused, that's going to be traumatic for you. So you need an opportunity to deal with your feelings around that, your sense that I failed my kids, I didn't protect them, it's my fault. Well, it probably isn't. But still, you've got those thoughts, those feelings. So everyone is affected by sexual abuse. Our communities are affected. Policymakers are survivors. There are survivors in every walk of life, and if they haven't done therapy, their unresolved trauma is going to affect their decision-making. So our economy, our politics, our social structures, it's all affected by a lot of harmed people. And only by acknowledging all people that are victims of these kinds of violence, domestic, sexual, public violence, whatever, only then can we really hope to change our society and create the kind of benevolent society you see in some Star Trek movie, where, we've eliminated war and we've eliminated poverty and we pretty well eliminated disease and blah, blah, blah. It's a nice ideal. We're a long ways from it because we look at things in a fragmented way. A lot of women's I think majority, I would say, not all, of women's organizations only have female staff. And I asked about that one time. I asked an executive director of a women's program, why only female staff? And they said, and her explanation made sense, but, I'll get to the but in a minute. She said that a lot of our clients have always been dependent on men, their fathers, their spouses, whatever. So by having a completely female-housed staff, from board of directors all the way down to cleaning staff, the message is that women can be self-supportive, that they can be self-actualizing, that they can be, they can approach and solve their own problems. They don't need some man to lean on. Well, I realize it's a valuable lesson for a lot of women, but I asked her, what if a woman was abused by a woman and doesn't feel comfortable with a female therapist? What then? Her response was, she can go elsewhere. Elsewhere, be a private practitioner for $120 an hour. Survivors typically don't have that kind of money. Many of them are low income, welfare, social assistance, and minimum wage jobs because they've been too traumatized to develop skill sets.
When I first got out of prison, I couldn't afford therapy. I was unemployable. And I had severe PTSD that was undiagnosed. I didn't know how the fuck am I going to afford a therapy.
Well, we provide therapy for people regardless of ability to pay, but a lot of organizations don't do that. If you're covered by compensation or if you can pay, great, we'll see you. But they also, when the compensation runs out, they end treatment. We don't do that. If the compensation runs out, we apply for an extension. Hopefully we'll get an extension. If that runs out and we can't get any more, we'll say to the client, we've gotten everything we can from that program. They're not willing to pay anymore. If you can contribute something to the cost, that would be appreciated, but we've made a commitment to you and we'll continue therapy regardless.
Well, it probably also helps the patient, even if they can only give you $10, to feeling a bit more in control of what they're doing. I remember I've paid for therapy out of my own pocket, and I remember I actually, these days, if I were to start doing therapy again, I would want to pay out of my own pocket. I actually wouldn't want the government paying for it, and for my own reasons. I want nothing to do with the fucking government anymore, right? But but I felt like even if it was not, because I've had sliding scale payment rates too, right? Because a lot of therapists I've met over the years will say things like, well, give me what you can, because they understand what you just said. A lot of people coming from some of these situations don't have a lot of money.
And I think a lot of therapists, I won't say all, but a lot of therapists in private practice will have one or two cases where they work for dirt cheap or free because they want to give back to society, but they also need to make a living, so the majority of their cases are going to be...
You need to be able to turn the lights on when you come into the office.
We'll be sitting in the dark for the next month.
So One question I always wonder about, and I sort of know the answer, but I'd prefer to get someone who's got a bit more experience with that. What do you think the differences are in male victims and female victims?
Well, that's a good question. And I think that across the board, it's pretty similar. The shame, the guilt, the distrust, the confusion around interpersonal boundaries. A lot of that stuff is the same. In fact, so often I've done training seminars where women are attending that have been working with women and saying, I'm starting to get male survivors and I don't really know how to work with them. By the end of their therapy session, they realize, oh, I've got all the skills after all. But the one major difference that I'm aware of, and I've worked with, probably around 50 female survivors in my life. So it's from experience. Even in a violent rape situation, a victim can have an arousal response. And for a male, that arousal response is far more obvious. We're not on television, but I think you get the point.
Yeah. Basically, your dick gets hard.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Happened to me.
Yeah, of course.
The guy threatened to kill me, and he was sodomizing me, and I got hard.
Yeah. Well, a lot of guys are confused by that because I guess I'm gay. Or offenders will use that. Oh, you gay. You like this. If you tell anyone, they're going to know you're gay. They play on homophobia. There's nothing in the literature that suggests that being sexually abused causes one to be gay, straight, bisexual, asexual, whatever, but it's pretty well guaranteed to confuse because you had a physiological response and you just shared that. That has nothing to do with attraction or desire. It has to do with biological functionality. If I touch you with a lit cigarette, it's going to burn whether you want it to or not. It doesn't matter. So when someone is stimulating your body, the nerve endings go to your brain and you get a signal gets sent back and you have an arousal response. We are hardwired to get aroused when we're sexually stimulated. So when a person is being sexually assaulted, they can have an arousal response. Well, men, I would say a large majority of our male clients are confused because of that arousal response. Or conversely, if they were abused by a woman and grossed out by it, what's wrong with me? That was a woman. I'm supposed to like it. Maybe I'm gay. So there's this orientation confusion that happens for the majority of male survivors. I have never heard a female survivor, regardless of the gender of her offender, say that she thought she was a lesbian because she was abused. I'm not going to say it never happens, but I think the occurrence of that kind of confusion...
It's so common with men.
And less common for women.
Again, out of my own example, when I first got out of prison, so I don't want to hijack the conversation, but it's pertinent to what we're talking about. Started as drug addict, 15, hardly any experience with women. Like, I'd lost my virginity, but very little.
Yeah.
Entered into a sexually abusive relationship with a man. Raped when I was in jail. And then some other assaults throughout until I was about... So then I finally got out of the life got out of prison for the first time at 25. Ended up fucking up that parole, but and I was back inside for about 2 years. So between that period of time, so 2005 to the summer of 2005 to 2006, I entered into my first heterosexual relationship with a girl.
Wow.
And then when I got out, then that all blew up, and I relapsed and started using drugs. And I got out again October 31st, 2007. I've been out ever since. So combining those two, so the last 10 years plus that 7 months. When I first got out of prison both times, I was extremely confused about my sexuality. Right. Now, that doesn't mean I thought I was gay. Right. But what it was I'd only ever, other than a few times, I'd only ever had sex with men.
Mm.
Men were the only ones who ever expressed any sexual interest in me. They were the only ones who ever made me feel pretty, for lack of a better term. They were only ones who ever told me they loved me in a sexually intimate way. And I had bad experiences with women too, just like being rejected or being bullied by women. Or in high school, I had girls play games with me, like they pretended to like me just to trick me and things like that. Yeah. Whatever, that shit happens. But so I get out, and I don't know up from down. Yeah. I know I'm attracted to women, but I'm scared of them too.
Yeah,
and they confuse me, and I haven't been around women except for the last 13 years, except in some kind of relationship where they have power over me. E.g., guards, probation officers, parole officers, psychologists, etc. Right. Before that, my mother and I have a very, very fucked up relationship, right? And if we had to, her and I, growing up, just so much fighting. So I get out. I hadn't had sex consensually in a long time. Yeah. I'm horny as fuck. I want to engage this. I missed out on my entire life basically of that part from that teenagers should be experiencing, and I want to do it, but I don't know what I'm doing.
Right.
So it's I can totally identify with,
Yeah.
like, am I maybe just good for men, even though I don't like them? And I used to struggle with that. I'd be like, well, maybe I should just, just bite the bullet and suck cock or let them suck me off. I mean, at least I'm getting off, right?
Yeah. Well, but if you're not attracted to a male, that wouldn't suggest you go that direction.
No,
but,
and that's why I didn't do it.
Yeah. But the other thing that's different, before we get too far from it, men feel like their masculinity has been diminished by the fact that they've been assaulted. I have never heard a woman say that she's less of a woman because she's been victimized. And that has to do with stereotypical norms. Women are submissive, men are dominant. So we're guys, we're supposed to be tough, we're supposed to be in control, and when we've been victimized, then by saying, I've been a victim, where I'm saying I'm vulnerable and real men are not vulnerable, therefore I'm not a real man. So none of that's true, but this is what goes on in the minds of men because we're all victims of socialized gender norms. And the social message is that men are supposed to be tough and in control. I mean, guys buy trucks for their sons and dolls for their daughters. Well, not parents, not just guys, but so we get fed this idea that I'm a man, I'm supposed to be tough and in control and domineering or dominant or whatever. Or even if the more benevolent version of that is a protector. But the idea that I can be victimized is something that a lot of men have a hard time embracing without a sense of losing their masculinity. I've never heard that come from a woman. I'm not saying that it's 100% true on either side of that particular gender line, but predominantly that's one of the major differences that I feel.
Something I struggled with because people would tell me I should have been able to fight back. Why did I submit? If the guy was going to kill me, I should have called his bluff. See, and then when the abuse happened in the institution, other guys heard that that the guy had fucked me, and they thought maybe they could get some too now because now I'm weak, right? Yeah. So I struggled with that for years. And one of the things that I've noticed as a comedian, I do stand up now. Lots changed since you last saw me. Rape jokes are something that's quite controversial in comedy.
Yeah.
I've heard dozens and dozens and dozens of prison rape jokes in comedy shows, and people laugh at them.
Yeah.
Without even thinking about it. Drop the soap in the shower, even if they're not particularly good jokes. And I'm a comedian who totally believes nothing's off limits. Yeah. But I did notice it when people would say rape jokes are never funny, ever, under any circumstances. But then some of those same people would laugh at, then I dropped the soap in the shower, right? And I thought, what's that all about? And I started exploring that, and it's because men just aren't seen as being able to be victimized. Or, isn't it funny that a PP went in the bum, right? It's sort of this latent homophobia, right? And almost like to be able to see, it's sort of outside of our consciousness. Prison, for one thing, is something that most people can't relate to. Right. And everyone who's there is bad and deserves to go there. Yeah. Popular media, or media and popular culture, has inculcated us and indoctrinated us to believe that everyone gets raped when they get there, and that's sort of an implicit part of the punishment.
Well, exactly. I was thinking exactly the same thing, and no one thinks that that's a problem. What's interesting, I think it was 2001, they passed the Prison Rape Elimination Act in the States, and President Bush signed it. There must have been new tanks tagged on to the end of it or something. I can't imagine him being that insightful. But according to that law that's been passed in the States, every survivor in any prison, jail, whatever, from county jail up to federal prison, is entitled to therapy. And any state that does not comply can lose 10% of their funding across the board. I would like to see that happen. Why isn't there a Prison Elimination Act in Canada? You're probably aware of the McDougall case.
No, I don't know if I am.
Oh, McDougall was a prison guard out there in the valley.
Yep, okay, but Dougal
and they figured he had a victim a week, and it went on. And he worked there for 20 years. And when Judy was out there working in the prison, she had a number of clients that were victims of his, and some of them would not disclose while they were still incarcerated because he may not be working there anymore, but his friends are, and you know what that's all about. Yeah. But the last I heard, there were over 60 complainants in the civil suit against corrections. And it's the famous McDougall case.
Right. Now I remember it. Yeah, I remember when I know a few guys who he got. Yeah. Because like you said, he was an officer at Ocala that started there, and then he was at another one, and he would go after younger guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and if you don't want to be in segregation or isolation, or if you want to get into that program that you're trying to get into, he would use his power position to get what he wanted.
Right. And I know a number of guys who...
Yeah, I mean, what people don't seem to realize is that a rape situation isn't some physical struggle where the dominant person wins mastery and gets what they want. There are all kinds of things. Some small little guy with about the muscle strength of a 12-year-old girl, if he has enough power, can get what he wants out of a big burly guy. And the same with women. The idea of a woman being able to overpower, it's not about her physically being able to overpower somebody. It's being in a position, say a supervisor. You want that promotion, or you want the job, or casting directors, in the Hollywood industry, all it takes is a position of power. It doesn't take physical strength. And people think, oh, well, how can a guy be raped by a woman? Well, it's not just erect penis being inserted in vagina. He can be forced to go down on her. He doesn't have to be erect if he's forced to go down on her. But like you said, there can be an arousal response even when you don't want it. And then if a woman just sits right down on it, well, there you have it.
I was reading an article last year or the year before about the Center for Disease Control in the United States changed their questionnaire when they were doing sexual assault surveys. Used to be that you could only be a victim of sexual assault according to their survey because the question was, have you ever been forcefully penetrated? They changed they added a question. They said, have you ever been forced to penetrate? All of a sudden the numbers of male victims, and a lot of these people didn't even consider that they'd been assaulted or abused. But I guess probably I can imagine they're doing the questionnaire like, wonder did anyone ever make me penetrate them? Her? There was that one time I didn't really want to, but yeah, I guess. And it's like, it's actually, and they realized the numbers of male victims were actually a lot higher. Yeah.
There's a book Matthew Mandel wrote. I think it's called The Male Survivor. I've got it here somewhere. And he was looking at studies that had been done at the time. And one of the things he was looking at was the gender of offenders that were identified in any given study. Some studies found as few as 6 female perpetrators being named, and some studies found as many as 60% female perpetrators being named. With such a disparity of figures, he looked at the research methodology. If the question was, have you ever been sexually abused? They were getting low numbers of female victims, or female perpetrators being named. If the question was, what was your earliest sexual experience and who was it with? They were getting descriptions of young boys having sexual experiences with older adult women. So a 12-year-old boy, 35-year-old woman, if the kid is heterosexual, even if he was a little bit uncomfortable with it, like, Mrs. Jones brought me into her house when I was collecting for the paper, and, one thing led to another. Oh, lucky her, she's hot. Yeah. Then he's thinking, oh, there's something wrong with me because I thought that was kind of creepy. I guess I was supposed to like it. So he now reframes his experience like, oh, I was introduced to sex earlier. In fact, there's a really brief YouTube video about this guy. I wish I could find it. I will find it somewhere around here. And he's saying, he starts out kind of joking, oh, sexual abuse by women, like that's pretty cool, right? By the end of this 5-10 minute thing, he says, I'm supposed to like it, right? And he's in tears. Because from this, how I'm supposed to think about it to how I really felt about it, it was such a beautiful transition. It's really quite impactful. I think I've
seen that video.
Yeah.
I'll have to look it up again. So, all right. I guess you're going to exit the society.
Well,
what's life going to look like for Don Wright after he...
Not radically different, because when I figure at the end of December next year, one of my doctoral students who's now doing a residency in the States will come back. She'll have her PhD by then. She'll take over as education coordinator. We'll probably overlap for a couple months in the fall of next year because she'll be back in September. By the end of December, I'll be out. She'll be in, taking over that position. I'll step off and I'll join the board of directors. So I'll still be involved. I just won't get paid anymore. But, I might still, if there's an invitation to speak at a conference and somebody's not available, I might go in and do it. But I do have this fantasy of going off to the south of France and doing a master's in visual arts, because one of my bachelor's degrees is in visual arts. And to get a student visa for the south of France and spend a year painting, I could handle that.
That sounds like a pretty good retirement.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be 70 in about 3 months or 3 weeks.
Oh, wow.
So I could have retired 5 years ago, but, I still feel like I'm in my 30s. So I look in the mirror and I think, oh my God, who's that person?
Have you found it difficult, because you haven't said goodbye yet because you're not gone, but have you found it difficult getting to the point where it's going to...
Well,
you're going to be exiting? I'm
thinking about this because for 2 reasons. One, I'm realizing I'm still kind of looking over the current executive director's shoulders, because I sometimes check in, has this been done? Has that been done? And part of it's just because I want to be helpful, but part of it is I want to make sure that something has been done. And I think the training was pretty comprehensive, but until it becomes a well-established neurological pathway in your brain, you don't do it automatically. So I might just say, well, the quarter's coming up. Make sure you've got all this stuff ready to hand over to the person that does our year-end financial reports. And sometimes you'll ask me, should I include this or should that go in separately? I mean, some things we hand in on a monthly basis to that person, and sometimes we hand in at the year-end. So sometimes he's uncertain about something, and then something new will come along that he hasn't experienced before. But I've got the mental processes in place that if some new issue comes along, I know how to work through it. I know the various stakeholders, whether it be funders or other agencies or people that we get cross-reference from, that I know how to think through the issue to come up with the ideal solution.
It's like muscle memory practically, right?
Yeah. And I think he's still developing that way of thinking through new things that come along. But he's getting there. I mean, the will is there. And like you say, he's very much philosophically on the same page. I don't have to worry about allergies or something. I don't have to worry about him taking the agency off in some strange direction that just runs completely counter to what this agency is all about. We work with transgendered survivors. We occasionally have female clients, but they're usually the partners of. We'll offer them 2 or 3 sessions to normalize some of the things that they're experiencing in their relationship. But there's also been occasions where it turns out that this wife is also a survivor, and because it's so difficult sometimes to find services elsewhere, we've gone ahead and provided ongoing support for that person. Quite often a different therapist then works with the husband. And it used to be that the coordinator of the RAP program would occasionally call us up and say, I've got a female client that I have tried to find someone that can take her on, but everyone's caseload is full. Any chance that you can take her in? And so we've taken in 2 or 3 female clients that were covered by the RAP program because there was just no place else to place them. And we had therapists that wanted hours, and so, okay, fine. But, we have a mixed gender staff, board of directors, victim services worker, male, female, therapist, male and female. Students are a mix of male and female. And there are 2 reasons why. Some of our clients have been abused by men, some by women, and a survivor has a right to choose which gender they feel most comfortable with. So it's important for us to have that option available. The other thing is that we're modeling egalitarian relationships between the genders. And I think we do a good job of that. So in a lot of ways, we've kind of broken down some of the divisive attitudes that are out there in the social services field. Now, we work with trans people because nobody else is working with them. We don't matter. When I brought this up with the board maybe 8 years ago or something, or maybe longer, one of the board members said, well, we should maybe talk to VSAC and find out who should work with them female to male and who should work with them male to female. And I said, no, I don't agree. If that person feels like this is the right place for them, then we need to be prepared to meet with them. And they said, oh, I guess that makes sense. So we've had female to male and male to female trans person in our staff because in our client load, because in some ways they have lived within the context of both genders, regardless of how they felt their true identity is. They perceived to be members of both genders. So is it the abused boy who's now a woman, or is it the abused girl who's now a man? Like, which part of that person feels that this is the right place for them? That's their decision, not ours.
Yeah. It's irrelevant. They feel comfortable here. Mm-hmm. Why not just serve them?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've talked about a lot. We've covered a lot of ground. For anyone listening, for the man or woman or person on the street, I always ask this just for...
Sure.
What would you like to say?
I would like to say that if you had an experience of some kind of trauma, don't just assume that it'll go away. Don't assume that you can just bury it and forget about it, because it is dictating a lot of your choices in life. It's filtering through into a lot of your attitudes that you have in a number of settings, whether it be personal relationships, work environments, social engagement, so on. So it's like tendrils reaching into every aspect of your life. So don't assume you can forget about it and get on with it. Reach out and get the help you need. If you're lucky enough to not be a survivor of sexual abuse, make sure that you're supportive if you ever get disclosures. And if you've got some money that you want to donate to a charity, there's a lot of charities around serving that population. They're struggling to keep on going. So there's a lot that, I think it affects everybody. So everyone has a way of reacting to this issue, whether it be a personal reaction or in a supportive way.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot, Don.
You're welcome.
Good
Thank you for this opportunity.
You're welcome, too.
And, I believe in you. I did when I first met you, so it's great to see where you've gotten to.
He's got to end it on an awkward note, make me feel uncomfortable. But that's cool. I appreciate it a lot. I met you over 10 years ago now, probably going on 15, and life has definitely changed for me. Yeah. And it's interesting. You're steady Eddie. It's the same old, but that's good.
Yeah.
Sometimes dynamic changes are necessary. They were in my case. But I think we, as a survivor, as someone who's been, I hate this term, but whatever, marginalized, all this stuff, we need guys like you, people like you, who are consistent. Because I came from a life that was, prison was the only consistency I knew.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? My family life was fucked up. Then getting out of prison wasn't consistent. So to have people in my life to not only be there consistently supported, but to model consistent behavior.
Stability is so important.
Absolutely.
I evolve, I change, I grow like anybody else, but there is that core of stability that I believe in what I'm doing, and that comes through in my work. And it's reflected. I just got an award for distinction for my lifetime achievement through the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General. And when I got that award, I said, well, I appreciate it and I'm happy to take it home. But it's not just mine. It belongs to my dedicated board of directors and amazing staff who are compassionate, caring people. And I am honored by the award, but I'm honored every day by the survivors that come in and trust. Here's somebody who's been violated by mothers, fathers, teachers, strangers, priests, people that ought to be looking out for them, and they are violated by these people. So here they come to an office full of strangers, and they give us their trust. And that is an honor that we don't take lightly. And so I'm honored every day by the survivors that come in and trust us.